Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Just this morning, I was listening to a couple of submissions from a few of my members, 3 in particular. 2 out of the 3 had this same exact mistake that we're going to talk about today. The same mistake that plagues home studio musicians, and maybe it's plaguing you and your mixes. We're going to fix it today. Before we do, if you want to get great sounding mixes, you got to have a system. If you don't have one, you can steal mine. I lay it out for you in my 5-step mix guide, which you can have for free. Just go to 5stepmix.com. All right, let's dive in. Okay, this video is going to involve a little bit of ear training, so get ready for that. First, let me just describe a scenario that perhaps you're familiar with. Let's say you're mixing a song. Typical rock song, drums, bass, guitars, vocals, keyboards, things like that. And if you're like me, you probably start with the drums. Get them sounding good. Awesome drums. Then you add in bass and you're like, awesome drums and bass. Then you add guitars. Then you add other guitars. Then you add keyboard parts and pads and all these beautiful things. Then you add background vocals and finally the lead vocals. And if you're not careful, this is going to happen to you. This will happen to you, especially early on until you learn to fix it, which we'll talk about in a second. So you get your drums sounding good. And then it's kind of like you take them and put them over here. And then you say, all right, drums and bass together. Got those good. Let's put those over here. Now, guitars, let's get those sounding amazing. Cool. Let's put them over here. And then so what ends up happening is a lot of times, if I listen to a mix, I can almost predict what order you mixed things. Why? Because the thing you mixed first, which for a lot of people is drums and bass, ends up being pushed pretty far in the back of the mix. And the last thing you mix, a lot of times, vocals, maybe guitars, those tend to be prominent and up front. Or if it's not that, it's whatever instrument you played. If you played like guitar and vocals, a lot of times those things tend to be the loudest and all the other instruments tend to be a lot quieter. But either way, you get to that point. So you've gone through your mix process, kind of the first round through, and then you sit and you listen to this kind of lopsided mix and you say, man, something about that vocal, it's just not sitting right in the mix. So you go in, what do? Well, you reach for an EQ. And it's still not right. Then you're like, well, I guess I need to compress it more. So you add a compressor or you change the settings on the existing compressor. And then once you get that in place, you say, okay, that's good. But now I've kind of lost the bass. I can't hear the bass like I used to. Well, let me just add some more compression. Compression's good, right? So you do that same thing. So you start just adding plugins to fix these problems. And then you're like, man, drums, they're not cutting through like they were at the beginning. I loved them at the beginning when it was just drums and bass, but now I can't hear them as well. Let's add, I don't know, a transient designer, or let's add a more aggressive compressor to our kick and our snare to really make it pop, right? And we've seen these things happen online in a million YouTube videos, so we can go apply that to our mix as well, right? Well, the problem is, of course, adding these plugins doesn't solve the problem, right? You've experienced it. You get to a point where you're like, well, shoot. And so you fix this thing with a plugin, and it's almost like playing whack-a-mole. You knock that problem out, and another one pops up, and you just keep knocking plugins. You keep adding plugins, knocking problems out, and it never seems like you make any progress. You just, okay, that's better, but now all this is broken. Okay, that's better, now all this is broken. And this is why people slam their faces into their desk when they're mixing, because it's almost literally an eternal cycle. You never really get to the bottom of it because everything you do causes another problem. It's like for every one thing you solve, 2 more problems arise. How do you ever get to the end of the mix? Let me tell you. But before I do, let's do a little listening exercise. So here is a mix in Studio One. I'm going to hit play, let you hear this second verse. It's not super dense, so you can probably hear things a little more clearly. There are 3 things wrong with this mix. I'd like you to listen and maybe even leave a comment and say what you think the problems are and what you think the solution is. Let's hit play and take a listen.
Trudging the cadence along and the ending it feels all wrong, and there's nothing to fill my mind. Scene of a dying flower, the petal.
Okay. What do you got? Now, if you were in the room, I would open it up to the floor. What do you think? What are some problems that you hear? And I'm imagining some of the answers that I would get. They're the ones that I hear right now. So I'm not immune to falling for some of these problems, just so you know. I just get to make the videos and then look smart at the end. I'm kidding. I don't. I leave mistakes in because I think that's super helpful too. So when I listen to this, initially, my initial impression is the bass is muddy, the vocal's a little sibilant and bright, and the drums are not as punchy as I want. Okay? Bass is too boomy, too muddy. Vocals are a little sibilant and harsh, and drums need some more like smack to them, some more attack to them. Let's listen again with that in mind. I haven't changed anything, just a quick listen, see if you agree with me.
Trudging the cadence along and the ending that feels all wrong and there's nothing.
Okay, so what do we do now? We've established 3 things that are wrong, which is great. That's a great part of the process. Let's find our problems and then solve them. That part's great. But have we really established the problem? More on that in a second. So somebody called me out. I said more on that in a second, and they said, well, technically you took longer than a second. So more on that in a moment. So if we said the bass is muddy, what's our solution? Well, we're going to come in, we'll open up the bass track, and we'll probably mess with the EQ some more. So we've got some mud taken out. We might take out a little bit more. Maybe we widen this, bring it down more, do something like this. We go in and we start trying to fix that problem, right? And if we do, let's actually do that real quick.
Trudging the cadence along and the ending that feels all wrong and
now on the bass, if you can hear it, I'll solo it. Now I'm hearing too much of this kind of upper mid-range, the jung jung. His bass is very growly and kind of plingy on the strings. Listen to that. Especially on the low note. Those little that come through, they're a little too loud now. They're kind of distracting. So then I'd have to go EQ that out. You see where I'm going with this? Let's undo that. And let's go, what about the drum problem? Well, the drums aren't punchy enough. Here's what they sound like by themselves. And so we might say, well, let's add another compressor. We've got one here doing this. Let's make it more aggressive, or let's add a second compressor or even a limiter or something, get those things to pop more. And then the vocal problem with it being more sibilant, let's listen to that.
trudging the cadence along and
Those S's are a little sharp, so maybe we throw a de-esser on there. All of these are legitimate solutions to legitimate problems, except those aren't really legitimate problems. You've probably guessed by now, the problem with all 3 of these things in the mix, for some reason I can't make the number 3 on my fingers. The problem with these 3 elements of my mix is the balance, the level of them. Let me show you. On each of these, you probably saw it if you looked, I've got a mix tool plugin that's adjusting the overall volume of each. So the drums were turned down by 3 decibels. The bass was turned up by 3 decibels, and the vocal as well, 6 decibels turned up. So if I turn these plugins off, which is essentially turning off these volume adjustments that I had made, and we listen again, you're going to hear, well, let me just play it for you. Listen to it now. See if those problems have been resolved. Well, let's try it again.
trudging the cadence along and the ending that feels all wrong and there's nothing to fill my mind.
All I did, you just saw it, was change volumes. I brought the bass back down where it needs to be, I brought the drums back up where they need to be, and I brought the vocal back down where it needs to be. When the vocal's here, that sibilance isn't a problem because it's just the right amount of s to get it to cut through. When the bass is here, the warmth is perfect because there's not too much warmth, because there's not too much bass overall. That was the real problem, not the muddiness. It was the overall bass was just too loud. Drums, I didn't need more compression. The drums sound cool, but they were just too quiet, which is a common problem when folks mix the drums and then they get kind of pushed down through the process of the rest of the mix. I just need to bring them back up. And suddenly all those problems that I had that were fixed by compression or EQ or any other number of fancy plugins that you own, those problems are solved. So why is this? Part of it is human nature. We like gadgets. We like to buy things and then use things, right? If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So it's natural that you would assume the more fun solution is the right solution. Turning things up and down, not super fun or exciting. Adding plugins and messing with the cool knobs on the plugins, that is fun. But a lot of times it's not the right solution. You still need those plugins. I'm not saying mix everything without plugins. What I'm saying is get the levels and the balances right before adding the plugins, and a lot of the problems that you would have had to solve just disappear because everything's in the right place, and then you can do more creative, subtle, maybe even aggressive things with your plugins because everything is at the right balance. The other piece of it, aside from just human nature, is just nature, like science. Our ears hear frequencies differently depending on what the volume is. It's this whole Fletcher-Munson curve. I'm not going to get in super technical, but the idea is if something is this loud, I hear a different EQ curve than if it's this loud. The louder it is, the more I hear the lower frequencies. That's a very rough definition of it. So at this volume, I might hear things pretty flat, but at this volume, I might hear it with more bass on it. And if that's the case, then this makes perfect sense. The bass was just too loud, therefore it sounded too muddy. I could have turned the low frequencies down, but then the rest of the bass was still too loud because the bass was too loud. That was the problem. So by just turning it down, we fixed kind of two birds with one stone. I am mixing my metaphors, but I don't care. This is something I'm super passionate about, and for those of you who made it to the end of the video, here is my solution. Get your levels right. Spend as much time as you need, more time than you think you need, on what I call the static mix portion of your mixing process. It's step 2 in my 5-step process. Static mix, where your plugins are forbidden until you get the static mix done. Then guess what? You're going to feel like you want to reach for plugins, but guess what? If you get those balances right, and if you keep that idea of balance in your head through the entire mix process, the plugin part of it becomes a lot more fun. It's less about fixing these annoying problems, and it's more about, okay, how can I shape this in a way that makes it sound even better than it already does? You will be shocked. I promise you, if you just go try this tonight, you'll be shocked at how good the tracks can sound just by setting the levels properly. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem intuitive, but I promise if you go try it, if they're recorded halfway decently, then just by manipulating how the levels sit and maybe the panning, you can make things sound incredible. I've done this sometimes where I get to a point where I say, this is an amazing mix, and I realize, oh, I haven't added plugins yet. That's a wonderful place to be, because then you really can't mess it up. You can, but you're already sounding amazing, so your goal now is to just kind of polish these things in these few different places to get it to the finish line. That's a much more enjoyable experience than that whack-a-mole version where you fix this problem and it causes this other problem to flare up because your levels weren't right. Balance is a really cool word. Doesn't mean they're all the same, but it does mean they're all fitting well together from a volume standpoint. Speaking of that 5-step mix guide, if you haven't gotten it yet, it is required reading around here. Go to 5stepmix.com, download your free copy. You can read it in a sitting and then go try it in your studio. I promise it's going to make an improvement to your mixes. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.